Hello! Who did the Germans try to exterminate? Slavic people, Jews, the Roma, amongst many others, right? Well, that's correct, but they weren't the first target. The world has seemingly forgotten that the Germans carried out the first of the 20th century, decades before Hitler took power. Before Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, there was Karabib and Shark Island. Before ovens, there was a vast desert. In this video, I'll explore the history of the Herero and Nama people, the excuses and brutal mechanisms Germany used to exterminate them, and how this forgotten laid the groundwork for the Holocaust, a subsequent denial that Germany continues to express to this day. Namibia in the late 19th century was inhabited by many ethnic groups and various tribes, but the German military had its sights focused on just two, the Herero and Nama. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Herero had a population of around 80,000 and the Nama numbered 20,000. The Herero are a Bantu people who traditionally lived in what is now known as Namibia, specifically the highlands, which are mostly arid and had been there at least since the year 1100. The area is flanked by two deserts, the Kalahari in the east and the Namib in the west, connecting in the south to form what's known as Namaqualand. Because agriculture in this area is difficult, the Herero primarily relied on pastoralism, garden cultivation and hunter-gathering, leading to them having a highly decentralized society. Herero chiefs were basically independent, and worked their land with their extended family with their cattle herds, representing their wealth spread over hundreds of miles. There was, however, a central figure known as the Omkuru, or the father of the clan, and was thought to embody their clan's ancestors amongst the various Herero tribes. Of course, the respect they showed this leader was results-based, and they would, if they felt it necessary, abandon poor leaders and seek others. Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Proton Mail. Freedom depends on privacy, but in the US, that privacy is under threat. Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act was meant for spying on foreign targets, yet it's routinely used to sweep up Americans' data too. And it's not just the NSA, the FBI and even local police can sidestep warrants by buying personal info from shady data brokers. That means your emails, texts, and calls are all at risk. That's why you need Proton Mail. Proton is privacy first by design. Headquartered in Switzerland, it's shielded by some of the world's strongest privacy laws, which prevents foreign governments from forcing Proton to hand over your data, and thanks to end-to-end encryption, your emails are locked before they even reach Proton servers, so not even Proton can read them. Use the link in the description to get Proton's first encrypted email service and take back control of your digital life. And Proton isn't just email. With Proton Drive, Proton Pass, and Proton Calendar, your files, passwords, and schedules all benefit from the same zero-access encryption. In a world where governments and corporations are always looking for ways into your data, privacy shouldn't be optional. It should be the default. If you use Proton VPN, you can also shield your browsing history from ad tech and data brokers. And with Proton's feature Easy Switch, or even import your messages, calendars, and contacts all in one click. Join over 100 million people who have already taken back their privacy with Proton. Get started for free at proton.me/Hakeem, or by clicking the link in the description. Thanks to Proton Mail for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video. In the latter half of the 19th century, around the 1870s, the Herero were living in relative comfort, living in an age of plenty, which European historians and ethnographers credit to having trade relationships with white people, which is their words, funnily enough. It was said that 75% of them were so well off that there's nothing else these white traders could offer them that they'd actually want. All these developments had the effect of centralizing Herero society to being ruled by new chieftaincies, all of whom were closely related. A kind of oligarchy, I suppose. The point of this presentation is to show that the Herero were, prior to the arrival of Germans, in a very strong position and were doing well for themselves in general. The Nama are a people that lived in the Namaqualand area of Namibia, very close to the land inhabited by the Herero. They were divided into two main groups, Great and Little Nama. For this history, we'll mostly be focusing on the Great Nama, who themselves were divided into 7 tribes, the names of which I'm leaving out because I don't want to be disrespectful with my pronunciation. While nomadic themselves, they had encampments set up in a very particular and unique way, on lands that were claimed by a hereditary chief. Both were highly intricate and developed societies, but because they existed outside of the 19th century European model, they were considered inferior. One of the sources for this video characterizes Germany's conquest this way. The German conquest of Namibia was rather difficult. This is a massive understatement. Germans, including Chancellor Bismarck and his successors, were happy to have new territory in Africa, but they didn't want to spend the money necessary and hoped that private companies would build the infrastructure necessary to extract resources and provide jobs for colonists. Of course, there was a large propaganda campaign in Germany to justify the colonial war in order to recruit troops who were paid more for serving in Namibia. Using this approach, they were, quote, expected to conquer Southwest Africa by peaceful and inexpensive means. Yes, they were expecting to conquer a place, or a people, by peaceful means. I don't know much conquering that happens by peaceful means, but we'll leave that be for now. Germany came to Africa with nothing but pure conquest and profit on their minds, exemplified by their choice to send businessman Adolf Ludwitz in 1884 to stake private, bogus land claims to establish a legal basis for making so-called Southwest Africa its first colony, similar to the US's move west. They would then, in typical European colonizer fashion, begin to exploit local ethnic tensions, stake false claims to land by purchasing it or outright seizing it without consent of the people who lived on the land, and begin settling. Settling requires land, though, so-called virgin land that had the issue of existing people living there. Both the German colonial administration and European settlers imagined creating a largely white new African Germany, where indigenous populations would be first confined to reservations without legal right and their lands divided amongst the settlers and corporations. Colonists, with military backing, were encouraged to violently seize land and livestock from the Herero and Nama peoples and to enslave them. A German colonial legal code was drawn up, where settlers had far more legal rights than the indigenous population. As an example, the testimony of 7 Africans was equivalent to that of a single colonist. This law allowed an unprecedented amount of indigenous women by Germans to go unpunished, which resulted in so-called extrajudicial retaliation by the families of these women, which would result in overwhelming settler violence supported by the state as a result. One missionary, reporting on what he saw, said, "The average German looks down upon the natives as being about on the same level as the higher primates, baboon being their favorite term for the natives, and treat them like animals. The settler holds that the native has a right to exist only insofar as he is useful to the white man. This sense of contempt led the settlers to commit violence against the Hereros." The historical record reveals several reasons why Germany decided to eradicate the local inhabitants, some practical and some ideological. However, it's important to note that underneath those reasons is the German military culture that was permissive of a kind of exterminationist approach to warfare, which I'll cover in the next section. Just keep this in the back of your mind for now. Beginning with the practical lessons, there are 3. The first being resources, namely occupation or possession of their land and livestock, meaning their source of wealth and livelihoods, via large-scale settlement. The second being so-called retaliation by attacks by the Herero, or as the Germans called it, a rebellion in 1904, which itself was in response to the aforementioned stealing of their land and cattle, which is completely understandable, that they would retaliate, I say so-called retaliation because the Herero and Nama have and had an unalienable right, morally and under modern internationalist law, for all it's worth anymore, to engage in violent liberatory struggle. The third being the least interesting, and that is the so-called honor and prestige it could bring Germany in the eyes of its fellow colonizer nations. Similar to how being carried out in Palestine is characterized as a war, so too was this one. Indeed, extremely racist ideology was common among the Germans, but that's not enough to explain their actions. The military campaign was conducted and organized in such a way that had no outcome other than the near-complete extermination of the indigenous people. They would, like their European peers, seek the total destruction of the indigenous people in order to impose so-called European values and lifestyle. What I haven't mentioned yet is the super-secret bonus 4th reason for this genocide, which was racism. Yes, the old-time racism based on nonsense phrenology and race science that made people like the commander of the extermination operation, Lothar von Trotha, believe that he was engaged in a world historical struggle between whites and blacks. In short, he believed this was a race war. This attitude filtered down into the settlers and was expressed as a mindset that supposed them to be the master race. Incidentally, Trotha took over from his predecessor because they were considered, and I quote, too mild. The government wanted a more direct, violent approach as opposed to the limited war being conducted prior. This escalation took shape in the form of communications and plans discussed between Trotha and the Kaiser, the contents of which make it clear, at a minimum, that Trotha would have near unlimited discretion to attain Germany's goals by any means necessary. This was formalized in the form of a proclamation Trotha made on October 2, 1904. He gave translated copies of the proclamation to the women of the men he'd executed earlier to take it back to their tribe. I won't read the whole thing, but here are a few important bits. I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Herero people. Herero are no longer German subjects. They have murdered, stolen, cut off the ears and noses and other body parts from wounded soldiers, and now, out of cowardice, refuse to fight. The Herero people must leave this land. If they do not, I'll force them to do so by using the great gun. meaning artillery. Every male Herero, armed or unarmed, with or without cattle, will be shot to death. I will no longer receive women or children, but will drive them back to their people or have them shot at. The proclamation was meant to deter surviving Herero from fighting back, which it distinctly did not. Now that we have the why, let's dive into the macabre details of how. In a nutshell, the genocide can be broken down into 4 phases. First was carried out by Governor Lutien, which had the effect of driving the Herero out of the colony's center towards Waterberg, which bordered the Omahake Desert. This was partially accomplished by the dubious purchasing of the best land mentioned earlier, along with so-called protective treaties. Forts were also built near and around settlements in Herero land and Namaland, leaving the area only partly under German rule. After his arrival, Trotha set about Phase 2, in which he attempted to surround the Herero people and their warriors at Waterberg, and end the entire campaign in one battle. Besides relying on poorly trained troops, Trotha's plan to attack on August 11th would prove to be too late, since the Herero fled southeast along the dry riverbeds into the desert, where they lured the units Trotha sent after them, hoping they would give battle, which they never did. Phase 3, beginning in December 1904, saw the introduction of forced labor and prison camps, some of which were run by private companies, just like in the US. 4 years later, a military report estimated that between 45 and 75% of the Herero prisoners in military prisons died while in custody. The 4th phase, somewhat confusingly, began in October of 1904, but is considered the 4th because it involved the Nama instead of the Herero. During this phase, the Nama suffered higher rates of death while imprisoned than the Herero. Now, despite all of the denials to the contrary, Trotha wrote a letter to Schlieffen. Yes, that Schlieffen. Saying that what is called the 2nd phase was meant to, quote, surround the majority of Herero at the Waterberg, and to destroy them with a simultaneous blow, then to build stations to search out and disarm the ones who escaped, and using bounties on the heads of the captains to bring them into my control and punish them with death. Even though his plan was total destruction, he ordered a detention area built to hold upwards of 8,000 men, along with an order for 1,000 chains from Germany. They even allowed companies to bid for slave labor to be carried out by the anticipated prisoners. But as noted earlier, none of this happened. Instead, the overconfident Trotha and his plan was plagued by poor logistics and troops with little more than basic training. Their failure turned to frustration, which led them to immediately follow the Herero, massacring the stragglers as they went. But they never really caught the rest, who mostly ended up dying en masse due to thirst, because they were in a desert, thus turning the chase itself into a weapon. This failure was followed by an order from Trotha on July 9, 1904 that stated, "We must exterminate them so that we won't be bothered with rebellions in the future." No prisoners of any age or sex were to be taken at all. Trotha ordered his men to shoot all the men and drive the women and children into the desert so that they'd die of starvation and thirst. He did that so they wouldn't infect German troops with their diseases, usually contracted by German troops through extensive of indigenous women. Facing down total annihilation, from August until the end of the year, Herero clans began indicating they want to surrender. Those pleas fell on deaf ears despite learning in November that some Herero leaders wanted to meet with Trotha to negotiate, but he denied their request. As a result, the Herero were cut down to a mere 17,000, most of whom were, over time, rounded up and, in typical genocidal colonizer form, thrown into labor camps. From those camps, they would be sent by train or wagon to other labor camps along the Otavi Railroad, and later would be heavily used by the private sector who ran their own camps. By April of 1905, the Germans held 4,000 prisoners, 25% of which were men. Trotha's replacement managed to increase this to 13,200 prisoners. However, due to the high death rates among prisoners, being starved and ill on arrival, the Chancellor referred to these camps as concentration camps. But these dry statistics and cold numbers cannot possibly convey the suffering and horror that was visited upon these people. The true nature of this genocide is revealed in the testimonies of those who witnessed it. Jan Clote of Omaruru. I was in Omaruru in 1904. I was commandeered by the Germans to act as a guide for them to the Waterberg district, as I knew the country well. I was present at Hamakari, near Waterberg, when the Hereros were defeated in a battle. After the battle, all men, women, and children, wounded and unwounded, who fell into the hands of the Germans, were killed without mercy. Some distance beyond Hamakari, we camped at a waterhole. While there, a German soldier found a little Herero baby boy about 9 months old lying in the bush. The child was crying. he brought it into the camp where I was. The soldiers formed a ring and started throwing the child to one another and catching it as if it were a ball. The child was terrified and hurt and was crying very much. After a time, they got tired of this, and one of the soldiers fixed his bayonet on his rifle and said he would catch the baby. The child was tossed into the air towards him, and as it fell, he caught it and transferred the body with the bayonet. The child died in a few minutes, and the incident was greeted with roars of laughter by the Germans, who seemed to think it was a great joke. There are more of these, so I'll keep 2 more on the screen so that you can have a read and enjoy the sheer barbarity of the Germans. In the beginning of their war on the German colonizers, the Herero outnumbered the German soldiers 4-1, many armed with modern rifles. The Nama, on the other hand, could only muster around 1,500 fighting men, only half of which had modern weapons, which still outnumbered the Germans in their area 3-1. The Herero used their short-lived advantage to launch sophisticated planned attacks which took illegally settled farms, routed German military units, killed European settlers, and laid siege to illegal German so-called villages, unlawfully and immorally conquered through theft and overwhelming violence. Having met quite a bit of success, the German administration was humiliated because their modern army was defeated by what they called half-naked savages. It wouldn't be long before thousands of German reinforcements with artillery and machine guns would arrive to turn the tables. Despite their technological advantage and own diabolical behavior, the Germans had the audacity to find their victims' manner of resistance cruel and dishonoring because they would kill wounded soldiers, and when they ran out of ready-made ammunition, would make their own bullets from glass or scrap metal, leaving often fatal, jagged wounds. Although in typical European colonizer fashion, they didn't feel similar dishonor about the cruelty they needlessly forced upon the Herero and Nama. Nor did they find any horror in their own take no prisoners policy that involved driving women and children into the desert to die. Despite all of the hand-wringing the Germans did about cruelty and dishonorable warfare, it was of course the Germans themselves who would prove to be superior to the indigenous people, only in their ability to be sick, unrepentant mutilators. The collection and returning to base of severed hands and ears, the latter of which was used to prove the number of killed by German commanders per their orders, was officially sanctioned. Additionally, Germans slaughtered large numbers of women and children, and, in yet another similarity with this, tried to claim that they couldn't help it because, and this is a direct quote, the combatants were using them as shields, which of course was not true. The genocide is said to have ended at the end of March 1907. All totaled, over the 4 years, the Germans eradicated 80% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama populations. However, the actual number of deaths will never be known. Much less importantly, Germans paid 600 million marks to put down the revolts, which is extremely high, especially when one considers they only allocated 14.5 million marks per year to the colony. Incidentally, the government had illegally spent money to fund the before the Reichstag could approve it. They were that eager for it, I guess. So far, I've taken you through a brief overview of the Namibian peoples, Herero and Nama, and I've noted times when actions of the Germans had eerie similarities of the Holocaust, which the next generation would carry out. This observation is not at all novel. Many historians have noticed the similarities. Their racial ideology justified the mass slaughter of women, children, and other innocent people. It's cliché to cite the 1948 Conventions on Genocide and quote the definition of genocide, but that's not necessary here. It's clear simply by the description of their despicable actions that they fit neatly within the later established definition, and thus is counted as the first genocide of the 20th century. While there is no direct path from the in Southwest Africa to the Holocaust, it's clear that the methods used and lessons learned were used to bureaucratize the killing carried out under the Third Reich, and thus is, if not the origin of mass murder by paperwork, certainly an important step on the road. Another is the establishment of concentration camps in Swakopmund, Karibib, Windhoek, Okanja, Luritz, and Shark Island, the latter of which was notorious for its harsh living conditions and extreme brutality. Of course, disease spread through these camps like wildfire. These conditions weren't an accident. It wasn't soldiers losing control in particularly hard battles. No, this was a slow and methodical, and above all, callous attempt at extermination. It's important to understand and study the intentions of those carrying out such immoral actions. The structural and material conditions that not only allowed but encouraged campaign after campaign of ethnic cleansing. This isn't to excuse perpetrators, but instead an attempt to prevent the re-emergence of systems and ideologies whose logical conclusions or goals can mold people into willing agents of genocide. One example of this is the racial component that labeled indigenous people as inferior to the German. Not just different, but deficient. Colonial ideology then provided the Nazis a mainstream angle, which they'd eventually demonize Slavic people and Jews with. This of course allows for laws like prohibiting marriages, but in order to do that, you need to know who was and wasn't a Slav, or a Jew, which led to the use of ethnic identification that was required to be conspicuous at all times. More disturbingly, Jews were required to collect and clean body parts of those killed, like skin and skulls, for study. Herero women were first subjected to this gruesome torture by being forced to clean the skulls of their people using glass. This would of course be used for so-called study in Germany. German soldiers and other officials also took home their own trophy body parts from their victims. To wrap up this comparison to the Holocaust and the Nazis, we only need to quote Trotha himself, who exemplified this Nazi-like mindset amongst the powerful in Germany. No war may be conducted humanely against non-humans. Of course, that sounds like a modern tweet in Hebrew that you click translate on, you're like, Jesus Christ. But yeah. We've been focused on the first 20th century, but the last the 19th century played a major role in the next. Talking about Belgium's King Leopold II's in the Congo, which killed far more people than the Holocaust, up to 18 million people. The Congo between 1870 and 1910 was drenched in blood because Europeans went on a colonial rampage for rubber profits. In the 1890s, it was known that wild rubber vines existed in several tropical areas, but none more abundant than the Congo. Having subjugated the indigenous peoples, Leopold had a ready-made workforce that had intimate knowledge of the area, and Belgium now found itself in possession of a land that was full of rubber vines. The Belgians required the men to have a quota of rubber to collect, and to make absolutely sure they got it, the Belgians held their women as hostages. Of course, working conditions were atrocious. Those who disobeyed orders were whipped with sun-dried hippopotamus hide, which apparently has razor-sharp edges. 100 lashes was a common punishment that could easily be fatal. We only have this limited knowledge about the Congolese genocide because in 1908, King Leopold II ordered that all the records related to the so-called Congo Free State be burned. Records that did survive regarding the land that had the most rubber show that the methods of forced labor were being used in the adjoining land occupied by the French. Regardless, the genocide that Belgium carried out before the turn of the century stands as one of the great catastrophes in all of human history and should be given as much attention as the Holocaust, if not more. It took until 2004 for Germany to recognize so-called excesses in Namibia, but strictly ruled out any form of compensation to the families of those exterminated. They likewise refused the term genocide because the term only became international law in 1945. You really have to hate liberals because only they can come up with disgusting excuses like this. Only in 2015 would Germany deliver a limp and impotent apology, a century after the genocide. It took until 2018, after significant uproar, for Germany to return skulls and other body parts from their museums and archives back to Namibia. In 2021, some funds, as a gesture of reconciliation, was delivered. Far too little and far too late. Of course, the word reparation was strategically avoided to prevent legal claims or liability for Germany. In this context, it's easy to see that the Herero and Nama wasn't an isolated or unique incident. It was part of a larger pattern of colonial that nearly all of Western Europe was involved in. The irony in all this is that the very need to exterminate everyone but your small little clique is proof of how weak this supposedly superior race truly is. If there is one thing you should take away from this video, it should be this. Genocide is never a singular event perpetrated by cartoonish villains laughing maniacally in their lairs. It is a cold, calculating process. It begins with mundane greed for land and resources. That is the material base. The Germans sprawled a crude map of Africa on a table and made a conscious decision to exterminate entire peoples for the sake of so-called prestige and, of course, profit, neither of which was achieved in the end. Genocide ideologies aren't as different as their symbols or languages and posturing pretend they are. Underneath the hood, cold material interest drives ridiculous motivations, racial or other forms of superiority, which so often end in genocide. A European quirk of capitalist degeneration of the soul, of course, re-emerged in the European settler colonial outpost that is a better world is possible. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.